All right, let's start. Hello, everyone. I'm excited for this talk. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nikki Yakovella, and I'm the director of the Outsider Art Fair. Um, this is going to be a really cool talk. We're going to take a closer look into Henry Darger's world, and we're in collaboration with Intuit, which is the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art in Chicago. So we're thrilled to be presenting this talk to you this afternoon. Um, Before I hand over to Deb and Lisa, I just want to quickly talk about the fair. The fair is currently running through till February 7. It looks a little different this year. We are doing a hybrid model. We have an online component, which consists of 45 online viewing rooms from galleries all around the world. I strongly urge you to go and take a look at those rooms. There's some fantastic artworks available, and that's going to be up until Sunday. Also, if you're in New York, we have 7 in-person exhibitions across 5 locations in Manhattan. You can purchase your pass, make a reservation, put on a mask, probably put on some snowshoes too, because it's still a bit snowy on the ground, but you should definitely go check out those exhibitions. They've been really well received by the press, which is great. And that is running through till Sunday as well. Some housekeeping. This talk is going to run for an hour or so. There's a little Q&A icon on the bottom right of your screen. We'll monitor questions throughout, and there should be some time for any questions at the end. So please type them in there and we'll try and get to them. And also this talk is getting recorded. So this will be on our website at a later date as well, if you want to refer back to it. Okay, so now to our speakers, Deb Kerr. She's the president and CEO of Intuit, and she has been since 2014. Deb has been a frequent speaker on many issues related to museum relevance, museum planning and activation for the public and for the social good. Leisa Rundquist is an art historian, professor and curator who specializes in the fields of modern, contemporary and self-taught art. She holds a PhD in art history from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill and currently serves as professor and university curator of art at UNC Asheville. They're here to discuss a forthcoming book, the power and fluidity of girlhood in Henry Darger's art, that was written by Leisa, and you can kind of see it on the bookshelf in the back there. And you're in for a real treat to illustrate the conversation. They'll be using source materials from the Henry Darger Room collection, which you can see in one of the screens. That's located at Intuit, so that'll be used as a reference as well. Over to you. Thank you so much, Deb. Thank you, Leisa. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Nikki. It's great to be here, and it's great to be with Leisa. She and I always enjoy our fruitful conversations. Leisa and I met in 2016 when we celebrated Henry Darger's 125th birthday year here at Intuit with a series of exhibitions. And Leisa came in with a suggestion of an exhibition ultimately titled Betwixt and Between, Henry Darger's Vivian Girls. And actually what you're seeing in the background is the catalog from that exhibition. A little plug, this is available from Intuit and it's only $5. It's a beautiful little book. But that exhibition really, I think, made a significant impact on our scholarship about Henry Darger. Leisa had delved deeply into influences that related to popular culture, Henry's deep Catholicism, and I think we learned a ton through that exhibition, both Intuit's team and our guests. And Leisa, that really took you on a new journey too, didn't it?
It did. And I also learned a lot during the course of that show, just from comments and feedback that I received. And Betwixt and Between is definitely part of my book. So it has a lot of the, it'll give you a taste, I guess you could say, of what my book is about. So I know, Lindsay, if we could go ahead, and we have a few images to show before we jump into the Henry Darger room virtually. So the book that we're talking about is coming out in April. So it'll be brand new then and available. And one of the things that I did with opening up the book is I used a quote from In the Realms of the Unreal that Darger took from All Quiet on the Western Front. And the quote talks about the loss of innocence during warfare, and Darger turned that quote into speaking to the loss of innocence going into adulthood, transitioning from child to adult. And that really struck me because it made me think about how Henry Darger operated like a magpie, in that he appropriated or stole narratives and images that he found intriguing, that were about childhood, warfare, storms, all kinds of subject matter. And so when I wanted to do more work about his art, I needed a place to kind of enter into it because it's so rich and so full of so many things that I decided to look at girlhood. That seemed a natural choice for me in terms of the fact that there are girls everywhere. His art is infested with girls, and the girls have very specific and particular oddness to them that I found also intriguing. So it seemed to me that Darger was someone who really filtered cultural ideas and sources, and he would modify these sources according to his needs. So the girl became this entry point for me into his art. And there are a couple of things I just wanted to touch upon before we look at some of the work, some of the archival work more closely, is that some of the themes for my book include the idea of littleness. And by that, I mean the power of the diminutive. And if we could go to the next slide, Lindsay. There are, of course, little girls in his work, and he refers to them as little. And so the sense of littleness is important as a running theme. And this is a great work that's often on loan to Intuit from Bob Roth. And what Deb and I have talked about in the past about this is that Darger is so attentive to little styles and the cut of the dress, the height of the hemline. This is all a style known as little girl style during the time period in the Chicago Daily News and other sources that he used. And it's very much based off of a Shirley Temple silhouette and all of the designs of clothing that she wore and then commercialized in the 1930s and going into the 40s too. But the next slide, so I look at littleness through three exemplars of virtue and Christian goodness that Darger brings up in his work. And the little flower of Christ, who is pictured here in this piece, is known as a little girl saint. She died very young in her early 20s, and she was a confessor saint who wanted to give of herself to save others. And that's kind of the sentiment of this piece. So Darger puts her in the background as a pendant piece to a Sacred Heart of Jesus image. Those are both holy cards. So part of that chapter is about the little flower of Christ and her influence in Darger's world. The next, please. Also, the little rebel, which he mentions in his writing. The Littlest Rebel was one of Shirley Temple's major films in the mid-1930s and really put her on the map as a child star. I also talk about Shirley Temple quite a bit more in a chapter about the aesthetics of cuteness and how cuteness relates to her her persona, but also the persona of little Annie Rooney, both orphans, of course. And this is also something within Darger's wheelhouse to garner these stories and these orphan characters that he uses in his own work. And then the last little influence is little Eva, this is not her, sorry, but little Eva from Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so these are all examples and kind of yardsticks that he uses to measure the goodness and the virtue of the Vivian girls, and often compares them back and forth, especially to little Eva. The other thing that, of course, is of interest, if the next slide, and this is our last image here, is the intersex characteristics of the Vivian girls and other girls within his visual story. And as a lot of you know, that this is something that remains unexplained in his writing, also in his own personal writings about his life and his interests. But as I began to look at Darger's work, noticing various patterns, oftentimes this kind of configuration of the girl body is made when they're in motion, when they're in peril, when they're running, they're fighting. And it seemed to me that this was something that was an adaptation for them that has meaning. He also describes these girls as holy and virtuous. They're warriors, they're saints, they're martyrs. He even goes so far as to call them other Christs. So thinking about the child here with the intersex characteristics, it is not necessarily what we might think of as a sign or symbol of a bad omen or something that is negative. These girls are good with a capital G. They're on the side of good versus evil. And so I interpreted this in some ways as this aligns with those kinds of traits. This visual manifestation has some sort of meaning, it signifies meaning. And I began to do some research on different kinds of female saints that are gender bending saints, and use that as a backdrop to interpret this idea in his work, this image. And there are a whole bunch of Catholic saints, female saints, that went through physical transformation. Some of them grew beards overnight to avoid being married to pagan men. Others levitated, showed the stigmata, while some were those that masqueraded as men in order to have social freedom. And then, of course, there's Joan of Arc, who is pictured in his work, and he compares the girls to the Maiden of Orleans. And what's not mentioned, though, what I found very interesting is there is a female saint named Vivia Perpetua, which made me pay close attention because of the name, of course. But Vivia Perpetua had a transgender dream in which she saw herself transforming into a man in order to go into the Colosseum and fight. And Vivia Perpetua is mentioned in the Catholic Communion Mass. She is one of a few female saints that is part of this group that scholars refer to as becoming male, or saints that, female saints that either physically or socially transgressed boundaries in order to become more like Christ, or have a kind of Christ-like fortitude. So of course that caught my attention, and that's kind of what I build on in that section of the book. So I look at things like littleness, cuteness, and of course there are very unusual bodily transformations that happen, and try to weave that all together into something that's coherent and interesting.
Lisa, so, the story of St. Vivia Perpetua was one of the ones that really struck me when we did the Betwixt and Between exhibition. I really was captivated by that. And as someone who's celebrated in the communion, I think that she would be, of course, familiar to Henry, someone who, depending on which stage he was in his life, was going to Catholic Mass 1 to 3 times a day. So he would be familiar with her name. And of course, it strikes me, of course, that her name is St. Vivia, and our heroines here are the Vivian girls.
Right. She is mentioned in a few of his prayer books that are in the room where you're sitting. And so when I look at all these different components that are really about kind of the social and cultural baggage of these images that he's using, that he's not just borrowing images, but I believe he's also absorbing and filtering modifying the meaning of those images too, and understanding the sense of childhood as equated to innocence and vulnerability, but also especially the orphan girl figure in literature and in movies has a redemptive quality. She redeems the lives of lonely bachelors and widowed men. And that's very much a trope that's part of Shirley Temple's movies. So Darger owned that picture of Shirley Temple. There's several Shirley Temple books. So archival bodies of work have been very important for my research, maybe even more so than the actual artwork that we see frequently. And so places like Intuit have been instrumental in helping me shape ideas, having access to all those materials.
And I think, of course, this intersex nature of the girls is one of the most controversial topics surrounding Darger. But I really felt, when we started talking about these girls appeared in this intersexed way, primarily when they were in battle or in danger, that really clicked with me as someone who was once a little girl and a couple times was bullied. I can remember thinking, "Oh, I wish I was a boy and could fight back in a way that I wasn't comfortable doing myself when some boys were bullying me at one point in my life." So that really the whole thing about the danger or battle, like Joan of Arc, that connected with me.
Yeah, and when I look at this juxtaposition of the girl from the Sears Roebuck catalog and then Darger's tracing, I think about how he is using tracing to reveal or unlock the secrets of Vivian girlhood. And when I say girlhood, I'm talking about the complications there too of what we see as a figure that is displaying male genitalia. That there's a kind of the tracing there reveals things for Darger that I think is part of his creative, his creative impulse, and that he is looking for these secrets, I guess you could say, unlocking them in ordinary images that do conform to gender polarities. And he's doing a very kind of non-binary look at gender, although he refers to them always as girls. So that's why I refer to them as girls when I talk about them or in my book. So we could go ahead and check out some pieces from your collection. That'd be wonderful.
Okay, great. I'm just responding to a comment here in the chat.
And I did have an image of a copper tone ad. Darger collected about 20 of those images. As I was doing this research, I also became aware of how frequently children are shown with their, or images of children, that's not an actual child, but a drawing of a child. Those kinds of representations of childhood show images of children revealing their body, or there are images from the Ladies' Home Journal of showing children nude playing in the backyard. That these things are frequent in early 20th century magazines and newspapers. And it's very much, my parents took pictures of me in the bathtub when I was little. There's a certain age where you quit doing that, of course, but it's kind of goes with this idea of childhood as an innocence. And so I think some of the disrobing of the children in Darger's work may certainly pertain to reinforcing this sense of their innocence.
So yes, these were parents' magazines that were in our collection. And you can see, I love this when I think about the image of the girls in Bob's painting that he owns, these different hemlines that are very interesting. Of course, there's the adult woman hemline length, there's the middle girl hemline length, and then there's the little girl hemline length, which is much shorter and corresponds with what we saw in that Vivian girl picture of Bob's.
Yeah, and again, corresponds to Shirley Temple's style. And
Absolutely.
even after she kind of outgrew the age, they kept her in those shorter skirts to keep reinforcing that little kind of aspect. Darger was also fascinated by the Mary Jane shoes, and you see them quite a bit on his girls. So they really signify, I think, girlhood for him. There are some wonderful tracings that are just of shoes on the bottom part of the leg that I really enjoy.
Absolutely. And I pulled out a tracing, Lisa, that you didn't ask for, but I think it also corresponds to what we're talking about here. So we've got, I hope we can see this. This is really hard to see.
Could you pull it out of the Mylar? Or is that too difficult? Or flip it open possibly?
I'm not sure that's actually going to help us, but I can try. It's still pretty faded.
Yeah.
But we've got the little shoes, the little Mary Jane shoes with the strap across the top. And we've got these little legs, and we've got a traced figure. Let me show another one that's a little easier to see.
And in that one, as well as in a few others where I see it's more pronounced, the socks are falling down slightly, which to me says a child. You know, they're not tidy, they're not pulled up. Yeah, I really love this coloring book image. And there are a whole series of coloring books that were created by the Stevens Company that you own at Intuit. And they are all about that aesthetic of cuteness, where the forehead is too big, the eyes are tiny, the nose is tiny, and other parts, you know, the clumsy bodies that fall over and kind of topple over. But it's this look of cuteness that replays over and over again in all these coloring books that Darger is drawn to. And also we're drawn to it. It's kind of a, cuteness is something that produces a kind of, scholars say, a maternal desire to protect, and that we see it as vulnerable. And cuteness in those coloring books also reinforces gender norms. You know, girls make cookies, boys play with slingshots and puppies in those books. So it's interesting to me how he takes things from mainstream culture that has these polarities of gender and then disrupts that, you know, transgresses that in his work.
Here's some little droopy socks and Mary Jane's. And I refer to this little girl as Little Cooking Girl. And those of you who are familiar with Darger's work will have seen Little Cooking Girl over and over and over again. And she's not always cooking. She's sometimes doing other things. She doesn't always have her eyes closed. Sometimes she's looking right out at the viewer. And she is, I think, one of his favorites. I have a couple more that I pulled out, Lisa, that I think are some of his favorites that I enjoy. But to your point about littleness, I end up calling them Little Cooking Girl, Little Umbrella Girl, because they are, they do have these short hemlines. They do have the little dimpled knees. They are showing us their littleness.
Yeah, and in all those coloring books, I guess you could say the insinuation is that these are white children, middle-class children. And so there is a kind of homogeneous character that he does put into his work. It's also, as I argue in my book, a kind of aesthetic perfection that these coloring books and a lot of also the comics and the cartoons that he used, you know, that he employs in his work. And this, a lot of the things that they show were things that Darger did not experience as a child. You know, he had a very difficult, impoverished life in and out of institutions. And this is like childhood bliss, making cookies, you know, playing, or nursery rhyme images that he uses from these coloring books.
Yes, this is Little Miss Muffet, and she's fearing the spider. You might have seen her in Darger's paintings over and over again, and sometimes she's facing the other way. He uses these in a variety of ways. So I don't think you will have found her, maybe, Lisa, maybe you know different, with the spider web necessarily, but you will see this fearful little face over and over again.
Yeah. Darger looked for those kinds of images where the children are animated. There is a sense, and I talk about that with the word vivia, which means to enliven, and the Vivian girls, that he's animating these girls, he's giving them life, and he is choosing those kinds of images where their hair is in motion, their mouths are open. The copper tone girl that's looking behind her, that's one of his favorites that he uses over and over again. And then he modifies them to turn them into the creatures, the Blengins, or the enslaved girls, or the Vivians in his work.
Tell me about this particular image, Lisa, that you were interested in sharing today.
Yeah, I think this one is important in that it shows at the front of all this destruction, a girl with her arms raised in defiance, and the resilience of this child while others are falling and running. The other two figures in the back are also children, and they're the most upright. And in this moment of a bombing, we assume, and the blast is happening, and this child is the one that, you know, reaches up and calls out into the air. This is a little heroine. She's a figure of strength and power that he has collected and just clipped. And I don't know if he used this or not in his work. Typically, you'll see some faint graphite pencil lines or something, but sometimes he just clipped things out to keep them. I think they're also inspirational. And I think they reiterate to him, or they did to him, the sense of the child as this redemptive figure, this child as a significant figure in culture, in storylines, and, you know, even kind of fantastic stories that he is interested in, like the Wizard of Oz, and uses that kind of energy in his work.
You mentioned little Annie Rooney earlier. And here she is in this tiny little cartoon that we have in the Darger room, looking frightened and very childlike. She's got the little dimples on her knees again.
Usually she's much more sassy. You know, she has her hands on her hips and she's running from a detective that's trying to bring her back to an orphanage. She is this child, you know, as all of his children are in his storyline, the child that has been separated from a family and separated from a family structure and the safety of that. And she's on her own. She's independent. She's one of the few brunettes in his work. Everyone else is blonde. So she really sticks out when you see her. But she is one of these orphan characters that Darger affiliated with and used as a template, you know, for his own, kind of literally, but also figuratively for his own storyline.
The last object I have to share today is this letter from the Society of the Little Flower here in Chicago. So this is from the Carmelite Monastery. Obviously, it says, "Dear client of the Little Flower." So we have to assume maybe that Henry wrote to them and received this back, or maybe he found this someplace.
Yeah, there are 3 other letters at the American Folk Art Museum in their archives, and a holy card of her. So she's an important figure for a lot of Catholics. I found that out doing research on her. She is someone that wrote a lot. Her autobiography and other kinds of spiritual writings are known as The Little Way. And she talked in floral metaphors often. And I bring this up in my book and about some of the images where the girls are surrounded by flowers, but she does valorize 2 specific types of flowers that she says in her writings grow in God's garden, and they give joy to God, and they receive his glances as he goes by. And she says it's not the lily, it's not the rose, which have a lot of iconographic, you know, importance in Catholic and just Christian imagery. She says it is the daisy and the violet, the meek and the humble daisy and violet.
And Lisa, which 2 Vivian girls have flower names?
Yes, there's Daisy Vivian and Violet Vivian. So when I see that piece that's at the Art Institute of Chicago with the Little Flower of Christ image in the background, I think of that as he's setting up some context. He does that again in another image that has Joan of Arc and a Christ figure with a storyline about the Vivians, and Violet Vivian has stepped in front of a bullet to save a priest, and they're all praying around her. And in the background is Joan of Arc and an image of Christ. So he does this kind of coupling or these pairings of martyrs, of thinking about sacrifice as a Vivian virtue, and does that visually in that work.
Leisa, we talked about the cuteness, we talked about littleness, we talked about the gender transformation qualities. How are these presented in your book? Are they chapters? Are they different sections?
They're particular chapters.
Okay.
And in each chapter, I bring in lots of archival material. I bring in his writings from In the Realms of the Unreal. I'm in particular interested in some of the introductions where he addresses a dear reader and then goes on to say what this part of the book is about. And in one of those introductions, he does explain why girls are braver than boys. And that's where he talks about the little rebel as a character, and also the Red Cross nurse are two examples for him that he's giving his reader, even if the reader is imagined, that these are examples of women, but especially one is a young girl with fortitude and with compassion.
Since you mentioned the littlest rebel again, Michael wanted to know if you thought it was possible he had seen the movie or the play. We know that he referred to the littlest rebel.
He refers to The Little Rebel, which was the 1919 play by Edward Pepple. And that play, I'm sure, was written about in the newspaper, which is probably, the greatest chance of him reading about that. And then when The Littlest Rebel came out, the media blitz for it was incredible. And there was all kinds of, summaries about the movie, pictures of her, merchandise. And it was really she's the daughter of a Confederate soldier, which is also in Darger's wheelhouse and his interest in the Civil War. And she, in that movie, at the end, sits on Abraham Lincoln's lap, this great moment where he shares an apple with her, and she negotiates the release of her father, who's in prison because he's a Confederate spy. So she melts Abraham Lincoln's heart, and he says, okay, I'll let your daddy out. So it's an incredible movie. It also has a lot of racial issues going on in it too, of course, but I don't know if he saw that or not. He had 3 different books about Shirley Temple in his personal library, and then that stock photo from her fan club. And that photo is interesting to me because on the bottom right, written in pencil, it says "to Lorraine Wirtz." So he probably got it out of someone's trash and saved it, but it's in really, really good condition. And I think the photo is from like the late 1930s. I found a copy of it online somewhere and was able to date it, but there's also a hole at the top. So he probably pinned it up and, looked at it a lot. And she is the face of childhood in the 1930s. She's more popular than any movie star, male, female, adult, child. And so she really controlled this whole social idea, construction of what a girl is at that time period. So I'm not surprised to see that he had quite a bit of Shirley Temple memorabilia.
Leisa, you and I talked about a couple of things. One of them is in The Littlest Rebel, Shirley sitting on Abraham Lincoln's lap. So little girl sitting on man's lap. That's one thing of interest. And then I also want to talk a little bit about beautiful versus cute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are a lot of books written about cuteness. I had no idea. And cuteness is this interesting, almost kind of psychologically laden aesthetic, a look, a feel that we are attracted to because there's a feeling of wanting to adopt it, wanting to protect the cute object, but also pity the cute object. So sometimes cute things that are bandaged up, or a puppy with a little bandage on its ear, you go, oh, pity is part of cuteness. And even for some theorists, this urge towards violence towards the cute object to make them more pitiful. I found that an interesting kind of dynamic in this idea of cuteness. But cuteness is different from beauty. According to some, beauty you put on a pedestal and you put the cute object on your lap. There's a kind of intimacy, a desire of intimacy with the cute object. And that's the dynamic of having a doll. And I think for the, this discussion about Darger, the dynamic of images of little girls that look like dolls. I think that cute aesthetic is something that, as we are as 21st century viewers of his work, pull us in and possibly make us worried in a way, or unnerved, depending on the spectrum of what you feel, about these children that are being strangled. And even though they're not children, they are representations of children, they're comic strip, comic book, coloring book renditions of children, we still feel uneasy about it. I think because we read into that social construction of what that girl is, and it's the age, the littleness, the aesthetic of the cute, and feel we're pulled towards that. And I think Darger exploits that. I think he understands that in some way, possibly. I don't know, I don't know what his intentions were, but when I look at his work, I think he really exploits that sense of how we might worry about those girls, because how else are you going to get through 15,000 pages of text about the same story if you're not worried about the main protagonists, and what's going to happen to them, and are they going to live through all this, and who's going to win? So I think his selection of certain kinds of imagery really adapts to this whole long, drawn out good versus evil saga that he creates.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. We do have a couple more questions. We talked about Michael's question about, do we think he saw the little rebel or the littlest rebel? But since Darger was basically an orphan himself, and we believe that he identified with the Vivian girls, religious, protector, goodness, could the male genitals be a way of putting himself in the art, a deep identification with that transcended gender?
I think that's totally possible. I don't go into that in my book, because my book is more about looking at the cultural elements and the notion of girlhood that he uses, but also modifies. But I think there's room in Darger's scholarship to walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can have different approaches that coexist, that we can think about and, deepen our understanding of the work. And these, different approaches to looking at Darger do have these moments when they can intersect. And I think that's definitely one of them. I feel like my book could be a beginning of more things to write. I don't know, or hopefully a jumping off point for someone else too, to take these ideas and run with them, so to speak.
Do you have thoughts about how his obsession with the Elsie Perelbeck case might have influenced him, as some of these other popular culture notions did?
I do bring that up in the chapter about cuteness and aesthetics, because I go into orphans and adoption, and also the vulnerability aspect of cuteness. And that in that article about Elsie Perelbeck, she's referred to as a blonde-haired girl with blue eyes and dimples. I mean, they had to write that in there to for some reason. Why did, that this kind of description of her is like any kind of blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl in Darger's world. And so that made me think about, how close in our thoughts about innocence, littleness, cuteness, how close that is to death and vulnerability, that they kind of cross-inform each other. These ideas about purity, but also defilement of that purity. And so I do write some things about abductions, and talk about his interest in that photograph. And of course, individuals like Michael Bonesteel have talked a lot about that in their work. So I reference that and weave it into other things, but there's also another book that is called My Child Lives, that's in the collection at the American Folk Art Museum, that was written by a preacher. And the book has some pretty horrific discussions about children that have been lured away with candy, abducted, found cut up in a bag. And it's a religious text that asks the parents to kind of adopt the viewpoint of the Virgin Mary, whose son has been crucified or martyred, to adopt the persona of the Maccabean mother, and her children were killed. So it goes into kind of religious context of how to deal with this kind of situation of abductions and having a child killed. And it's pretty graphic. I was really surprised. And it reads like some of the writings in the newspaper of these more graphic, violent descriptions of how children have been abducted and killed. And so Darger had that in his collection. And here this is kind of coming from that arena of his religious background and authority figure. And then he's reading these other things in the newspaper. And I'll bring up another scholar, Mary Trent, has written a lot about this in her work with Darger, and how Darger is conversant with what's going on around him. The paper was full of stories about orphans and full of stories about abductions. Michael Moon has written about this too. Even in the comic strips, there's all these the storylines, even in Dick Tracy, about adopting and abduction and children lost. So Darger is bringing in all that into his own, literally into the room you're in, pinning things up on the wall, being concerned about it, surely, as a lot of people were, and putting that into his work. Obviously he was much more obsessed with that image of Elsie, and that it becomes, she's the first martyr, and then that kind of triggers the whole storyline for him. But she's one of many children that he probably had his eye on in terms of looking up their stories in the paper, following it in the paper, hearing about it. So Chicago was full of these kinds of stories during his lifetime.
Yes, you've gotten a couple questions about vulnerability, about, here's a good one. Was he around girls when he was growing up? Did he have any exposure to girls, or would his exposure to girls have come mainly through pop culture? But wasn't the Asylum for Feeble-Minded Children a co-ed facility?
I believe it was. To what extent, he doesn't really write about that. It's his, he wrote a biography, and more than halfway through it, it kind of spirals into the story about a tornado and becomes this fictionalized story. And whatever he wrote about his life growing up, he's very reticent to talk about being fearful, his own vulnerability. And so the details of his life are very difficult to glean, to pick out. I know that John McGregor did a great job with his biography and kind of pulled together lots of information, but these kinds of nuances about his life, we don't really know. And sometimes we look towards his art to help us fill in those blanks, but again, that's kind of making some assumptions and making some projections there. We're not, we really don't know. I think with Henry Darger and his life and his art, that at some point you have to be okay with some ambiguity, and kind of, not try to fill in the blanks because, we don't know that information, right. But to kind of look at it and do your best with what is available, and what you can work with and use for interpretation.
There's a question here about our Henry Darger's archives at both Intuit and the American Folk Art Museum. We're actually, the two museums and several others are working together on his archival materials. The Intuit, thanks to a crowdsource effort recently, Intuit was able to digitize the microfiche that we had. So it's not a perfect version of In the Realms of the Unreal, and that is now available. You can find the link on our website, which is art.org. that is now housed on the Illinois State Library website. So if you want to find the link, you can go to our website. There's a section on our collection and Henry Darger. You can find that link there. And I know that the American Folk Art Museum is also working on ways to make the materials more accessible because they're so fragile that we can't really make those available to everyone. The other thing that's happening right here on site is that because of the need to reassess our Darger materials for conservation work, we'll be taking our room down this summer, and we're providing a series of 3 exhibitions. The first one is going to be about Darger as author and reader, very much to some of your points, Leisa, about the materials that he was reading and what was he interested in. So, and Michael Bonesteel's work on Darger as author. And then we're going to transition to looking at his techniques and materials. And then at the end of the summer, we'll be looking at how do we do a conservation assessment of this work. We'll be taking the room down. We are going to be gathering information from our visitors and guests about what they're interested in, and that will inform how we recreate the Darger room in our planned renovation and how we represent the Darger room in the interim. What is most interesting to folks, and what ways do they want to have access to the real materials? And thanks to you, Leisa, we're actually sourcing some of those books so that we can have those same editions that Henry had that are in the collection of the American Folk Art Museum on hand for people to see those actual volumes of works that Darger was reading. I think that'll be really interesting for folks. Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Melissa, who is asking about Darger wanted to adopt a baby with help from the Catholic Church. We know that during the time of the Korean War, when Korean War orphans were being adopted and subsequently the Vietnam War, he was interested. But as a poor and single man, that wasn't an opportunity for him. Do we know, do you, or I know that Michael was on earlier, do we know anything about how that he expressed his dissatisfaction with the church? We know that over the years, he was always finding some reason to be dissatisfied with the church and to protest against the church.
What I do know, and maybe Michael knows more than this, is that there are a couple scraps of paper that I found in the archives, and I think others have. I think John McGregor references them too, where they're written in Darger's hand, and he writes at the top something like "found on the sidewalk." Like, this is not me, basically. Like, I found this on the sidewalk, and it is someone asking some rhetorical questions about why the Catholic Church would not help a man who has essentially a good heart, not help him adopt a child, and what would the reasons be? And so and there are some reasons that he then goes through on this piece of paper as if maybe this is helping me think through why I've been denied. So I did not see any official paperwork, but I did see 2 written, and I don't even know if to call them letters, but just like ruminations on this sense of why I was denied. So it seems to me that he may have at least asked someone, inquired about it. I don't know if he officially applied, but those to me signal that he's mad, that he did not. Somehow he inquired through some means and that he was denied, or at least told maybe this isn't going to work. You shouldn't even go any further with your inquiry. Right. Yeah.
Right. Here's a question that I get asked a lot, and here's a question: could it be that he never saw female genitalia? And some of the girls appear to be girls as well as boys.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, how do all of us see the other sex, I guess, as you're growing up? Through various means, but there is a picture of a naked woman that he took from a magazine. It doesn't look like it's pornographic necessarily in nature, and he traced her body, and she's leaning against a dresser. I saw that, but the information that's given is very minimal in terms of anatomy in that picture. He was in and out of institutions. He hung out on the street with people. We find ways where we figure out things on our own. But I don't know. The answer to that really is I don't know how to answer that. But just to say that, as young children, everyone is inquisitive, and somehow we find this information out, regardless if your parents talk to you and have the talk with you or not. But I do recall when I gave a talk at Intuit, and there was someone in the audience, I'm not going to say his name, but his father is a well-known artist and he's a physician. He said, looking at Darger's work, he wasn't sure that Darger was exactly drawing male genitalia. He felt it could be something that was more fluid than that. So I found that interesting too. And that's why I've been asked, why do you not use transgender, girl, or why I use intersex? And I feel like that is the best way to describe the bodies of these children that he is drawing and modifying, and that transgender can also relate a lot to how you identify, or is related to how you identify, regardless of what your body may look like. And transgender could, from what my discussions with my students here, could also relate to just being non-binary, kind of opting out of gender altogether. So I don't know if transgender is the best way to describe these girls. So I just use little girls, which is how Darger describes them, regardless of how they look. And I almost think that in some way that Darger modifies their bodies in these moments when they need power, when they need a burst of energy. And I've described it as the word vivam is also part of the etymology of Vivian and Vivi. And vivam means I shall live. And so I think of them as kind of like Shazam, as a superhero kind of way, changing when they need to, or something happens in the world that Darger has created, where Vivam, especially with the Vivian girls, because they don't die. They go through all kinds of explosions and they get shot and everything happens to them, and they still live on. I shall live, this cry of resistance is kind of what I hear in my head when I think about this. And so I almost think it's a kind of adaptation for the moment, actually. And I see what he's doing as a storyline. This is a big narrative. Right, and these are protagonists in a story, and they have special powers, and they continue to live no matter what. They don't age. They just keep on going. And this is just part of who they are.
Fantastic. Leisa, I'm going to take 2 more questions quickly. One of them, I think this might be a bit off your areas of expertise, but one of our guests is sharing that the adult son has autism and is an artist and is also attracted to cuteness, and it borders on fetishism. I see similarities in Darger's work, the childlike mind, for instance. Do you have any comments to that?
Yeah, I think if you look at cuteness in Japan, which is called kawaii, has a very sexualized and violent side to it. I think cuteness is something that draws us in, and of course, children love cute objects, but so do adults. It does trigger something in us that we want to be close to that object. I have cute things on my desk, these little statuettes, and they're tchotchkes that I like. I think there is something inherent in that big-eyed, distorted features that we feel, kittens, puppies, all these things that pull at our heartstrings also, I think, have a deeper psychological pull on us. And, I would suggest to read some of the texts that are out there about cuteness. There are several books, and they do kind of talk about our attraction to these types of objects. I bet that would be helpful. But it is something that I think, for whatever reason, children are much more attracted to. Adults, I think, maybe hide that more, but adults definitely in different cultures are very into cute things.
Absolutely.
Mickey Mouse, for example, is big time in the US, and that he is a cute object.
Absolutely.
That's for sure.
There's one more sort of complex question here. Let's see if we can squeeze it in. Someone who was talking about the connection between Darger and Perpetua and her dream visions, which are associated with the stairway to heaven, how she sees a ladder to the sky, and curious about that connection with Darger's fascination with weather patterns, and if Christian mythology is deeply rooted in his understanding of the popular culture he was fascinated by. So that's
wow.
There's a lot packed into there.
Yeah, that's really great. I don't have, so a lot of times I would operate on a hunch about Darger. Darger, my dissertation was about fire in Henry Darger's art. And I started doing research on the Chicago fire and then all the commemorative celebrations of it and the ways that Darger talks about it in his biography and lighting fires and going to watch fires and what does that mean for Chicago. And I'm going to get off topic here, I guess. But the hunch here, is I would find things in the archives that would then confirm my hunch, and then I would build on that. I have yet to find something that connects Henry Darger to Vivia Perpetua directly. And if I do, it'll be the jackpot for me. But I think, I do bring up this idea of his use of names and Vivian, Vivia, and mostly overlay it with this idea of these saints that were transgressive in how they transgress gender boundaries. But I wouldn't be surprised, if there are some things about weather, because there are several dreams that were sanctified as visions with Vivia Perpetua, that he may have known of from pamphlets. There's lots of Catholic pamphlets that tell stories. I've read some, recollections from different authors, like, of course, Michael Moon talks about this, but growing up Catholic and Catholic plays that would reenact the lives of the saints and all their bloody martyrdoms.
Yeah, and those little pamphlets are right at the back of the church when you
yes,
come in.
Yes,
right?
So the possibility, and then even nuns would take on the name Vivia Perpetua as a name. So even beyond the kind of maybe mentioned within a more formalized setting of a mass, you would have these other kind of more informal conversations. So I wouldn't be surprised if he had, knowledge of her through that means, as opposed to something more, I would say, as a kind of message in the church. And so his church probably had Latin Mass up until the 60s. Yes. Yeah, I think there's something there to the plum to keep teasing out with Vivia Perpetua, and maybe then begin to find more of that link, something more direct that's buried in one of the archives, and some notation possibly he made on the side of something that could say, yeah, he was well aware of Vivia Perpetua and kind of studied her life.
And as you said earlier, he was a magpie. He would pick and choose things that were of interest to him and weave those together for his stories. I think that's a perfect example. Yeah. Leisa, this has been so great. Thank you for taking the time with all of us and
Thank you so
for
much.
sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me
with us.
Great.
Yeah. And thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, and thank you, Deb. This has been a really great discussion. So thank you both for your time. This is completely captivating. So yeah, like I said, this will be available on our website at a later date if you need to refer back to it. Thank you everyone for joining us. And don't forget, The Outsider Up There is on in person and online until February 7th. But yeah, thank you, Deb. Thank you, Leisa. Enjoy your day. Thank you. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.